It was late October of 2016 when I decided to take a week off and get away from the noise. I'd been working in a car parts warehouse just outside of Manchester for nearly 8 years without more than a long weekend to myself. It wasn't even a proper holiday that pushed me into taking time off. It was burnout. My body felt heavy all the time. I was snapping at people for no reason. I wasn't sleeping, so I booked a week off and looked around for somewhere remote to stay. I didn't want to be around people. I didn't want sightseeing or tourist traps. I just wanted somewhere cold, quiet, and isolated. I found the listing through a small rental site I'd never used before. The place was called Low Fell Lodge. It was up in the north of Cumbria, a bit past Cockermouth, tucked into the woods off a single-track road near a sheep farm. The pictures were plain, just a small timber cabin with one bedroom, a stone fireplace, and a few bits of old furniture. Nothing fancy, but it had what I needed. Seclusion, a working heater, and not a soul nearby. I booked it for 6 nights and drove up on a Sunday morning. The closer I got to the cabin, the narrower the roads became. The last bit of the journey was up a bumpy track that curved through trees I didn't recognize, with leaves turning yellow and brown. The sky was overcast, and the light felt a little dim even though it wasn't even 3 p.m. There were no other cabins nearby, no other houses, just this squat, square thing with a sagging roof and thick wooden walls darkened from years of rain. I parked in the clearing outside and turned off the engine. Everything was silent. No wind, no birds, just the tick of my car cooling down. Inside, the place smelled of dry wood and dust. There were cobwebs in the corners, and the windows looked like they hadn't been cleaned in years. But the place had power, heat, and running water, and once I got the small heater going in the main room, it warmed up fast. I unloaded the food I brought, mostly tinned stuff and bread, and put the rest in the fridge. No phone signal, no Wi-Fi. Exactly what I needed. That first night was uneventful. I sat in the old armchair by the fire and read a book I hadn't touched in months. The wind picked up around dusk and made the trees creak a bit, but it wasn't unsettling. In fact, it felt good, isolated, safe in a weird way. I slept better than I had in weeks. It was the second night that things started to feel off. I woke up around 2 in the morning. Not because of a noise, at least not one I could remember, but I sat up in bed suddenly, like my brain had heard something while I was asleep. The bedroom was cold, even though I turned the heater up before bed. The door to the room was open, which I was sure I'd closed. I got up and walked barefoot into the main room. The fire had gone out, and the room was lit only by the moonlight coming through the thin curtains. I checked the front door. Still locked. The windows were all shut. I told myself I must have left the bedroom door open and gone to bed too early, before the heater had really kicked in. I made a cup of tea, sat in the chair again for a bit, then went back to bed. The next morning, I noticed something odd on the inside of the front door. A smear. It looked like it had been made by a hand, maybe a bit of damp soil or something greasy. Just a faint mark, about the size of a palm, smudged downward. I wiped it off with a bit of tissue and didn't think much more about it at the time. The third day was when I saw her. It was around 4:30 in the afternoon. The sun was dipping low and casting this pale yellow light through the trees. I was out back, behind the cabin, gathering bits of wood to keep the fire going longer that night. The air smelled of damp leaves and peat. I was crouched down near a rotten log when I felt that weird sensation, like someone was standing behind me. I stood up slowly and turned around. She was maybe 30 feet away, standing just beyond the tree-line. A woman, but she didn't look right. Her clothes were old. Not vintage, not quirky, just old. Like the kind of clothes someone would have worn in the 1980s, but they looked like they hadn't been washed in years. A long, dirty skirt and a thick wool jumper. She wasn't moving. She didn't speak. She just stood there, staring at me. Her hair was matted and dark, hanging down in tangled clumps over her face. I couldn't see her eyes properly, but I could feel them on me. I raised my hand a bit, like a half wave, then stepped back toward the cabin. I didn't take my eyes off her. She didn't react, didn't wave, didn't turn her head. I got back inside, shut the door, and locked it. I looked out through the curtain. She was gone. I checked the other windows. Nothing, just trees and the edge of the clearing. I told myself maybe she was just a local. Maybe she was walking through the woods and saw me and froze. But something about the way she stood there, the clothes, the dead expression, it didn't feel like an accident. I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire going and sat up in the chair, staring at the front door. Every time the wind shifted, I flinched. I kept thinking I'd see her through the window, standing in the trees again. The next morning, I found something beside the door. It was a piece of twine, wrapped into a tight bundle with bits of dried grass poking out. At first, I thought it was a bird's nest or maybe some natural mess that blew in. But it was too neat, too deliberate. The twine was tied into a knot, and inside was a dead beetle or some kind of insect, crushed flat. I threw it out into the woods. That day, I didn't go outside. I stayed in, pacing the cabin, checking the windows. Around noon, I turned the radio on, an old battery-powered thing I brought with me, but there was only static. I pulled out the old map I'd packed and studied it. The nearest actual town was nearly 8 miles back down the road. The sheep farm was 2 miles west. I thought about walking there, but I didn't want to leave the cabin unattended. If she came back while I was gone, by the time the sun set, I was already tense. I lit every candle I could find. I kept the fire roaring. But sometime after midnight, the power cut out.
No lights, no heater, no frium.
Just silence. I got up and stood in the main room, holding the torch I kept by the bed. The fire was still going strong. I checked the fuses, but nothing seemed tripped. The switchboard was ancient, though, and I figured maybe the old lines just gave out. Still, the timing felt wrong. I locked the door, triple-checked the windows. Then I saw it. Out back, just beyond the trees, there was a figure again. Same place, same posture. But this time she was closer, maybe 15 feet from the tree line. The torchlight didn't reach that far, but I could see the outline of her shoulders, the dark hair, the strange bulk of her clothes. She didn't move. I didn't sleep that night either. At sunrise, she was gone again. But the ground outside the back door was disturbed. Patches of moss pulled up, small, narrow footprints in the mud, bare feet. I packed everything. I shoved all my clothes into the bag and stuffed the food back into boxes. I tossed the bedding in the car and locked up the cabin. I didn't even bother to sweep or clean. I just wanted out. The track back to the main road was slick with rain, and my tires slipped once or twice on the turns, but I didn't stop. I didn't even look in the rearview mirror until I hit the A road again. I emailed the rental site the next day to tell them I was cutting the trip short. They didn't reply. I checked the listing again 2 days later and couldn't find it. The page was gone. Out of curiosity, or maybe something darker, I tried to look up more about that area. I checked old forums, even local newspaper archives, to see if there were stories about squatters or break-ins or even missing persons. Nothing, just the usual countryside stuff. Sheep thefts, flooding, and occasional road closure. No mention of a cabin. No mention of any woman in the woods. It's been nearly 9 years since that week, and I still think about it every October. I still don't know who she was, but I know she was real. I didn't imagine her. I didn't hallucinate. I wasn't on anything. She stood there watching me, not once, not twice, 3 times, each time closer. I haven't gone back to Cumbria since. I never stayed in another cabin. I don't even like the countryside anymore. The silence makes me nervous. I keep the curtains drawn at night. I double lock the doors. And sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night for no reason, I find myself looking at the door. waiting for a sound I can't explain, wondering if maybe, just maybe, I brought something back with me. But nothing's ever come to the house. Nothing's followed me. Not yet. I hadn't thought about that place in years. I tried not to, but it came back to me when I was sitting in the garage one night, fixing the rear axle on my truck. Something about the smell of the grease and the quiet of the night reminded me of the cabin. It had been 21 years. I was 17 when I first went up there with my uncle. Now I was 38, divorced, living alone in Tennessee. My uncle died of cancer 5 years back. I hadn't seen him in nearly a decade before he passed. I didn't go to the funeral. I remembered that cabin like it was etched into my bones. The peeling wood, the rusted nails, the crooked floorboards. The long hike in through the woods where the road stopped and you had to walk the rest. It wasn't even our cabin, not technically. It had been his friend's, a guy who disappeared in the early 90s. Left his truck at the bottom of the hill one winter and never came back. Search teams looked for a week. Nothing. After that, nobody wanted the place. The family let my uncle use it for hunting, and we went up there 2 or 3 times when I was a teenager. But there was one trip I never talked about. And sitting there in my garage that night, sweating in the summer heat, I started thinking about it again. I didn't want to, but I couldn't help it. I started remembering the smell inside the cabin. The way the trees creaked even when there was no wind. The deep scratches on the back door that no one ever explained. They ate at me for a week. Couldn't sleep. I kept walking out to my garage in the middle of the night and staring at the old camping gear on the shelf. The same pack I'd used back then. The more I tried to ignore it, the more the memories came back. And one morning, without really thinking it through, I packed up and drove north. It was a 6-hour drive up into the Virginia mountains. The same winding road I remembered, narrow and cracked, bordered by thick green woods on both sides. Not much had changed. I passed the same old gas station just before the road started to climb, the one with the rusted Pepsi sign hanging off the side. I filled up there. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. By the time I got to the trailhead, the sun was starting to drop low. I parked off the side of the road in the gravel pullout like we used to. The old dirt path that led to the cabin was still there, overgrown but visible. I put on my pack and started walking. The hike took longer than I remembered. It was almost all uphill for the first mile, then flattened out before dipping back down into a little valley where the cabin sat. I passed the old rock pile we used to use as a marker. At one point, I thought I heard something moving in the brush beside me, but when I stopped, it was quiet again. The forest was dense and wet. The air smelled like moss and would rot. I got to the cabin just before dark. It looked worse than I remembered. The roof had partially caved in on one side. The front steps were gone, replaced by weeds and vines. The door was still there, hanging slightly open. I stood there for a few minutes, just looking at it. The light was dim, filtering in through the trees. I had a flashlight in my pack, but I didn't turn it on yet. I wanted to see it in the fading natural light. Inside, it smelled worse than I remembered, like old damp wood and animal waste. The floor was warped in places, and a large section of the ceiling had collapsed near the back wall, letting in rain and leaves. Most of the old furniture was still there, the table, 2 chairs, the metal-framed bed with a rotted-out mattress. There was a hunting knife on the table, rusted and dull. I didn't remember that. I set my pack down and unrolled my sleeping bag in the driest corner I could find. I didn't plan to stay long, maybe a night just to get it out of my system. I heated up a can of stew on my little camp stove and ate with my back against the wall, watching the door. The night came on fast. I could hear crickets and frogs outside, and something heavier moving in the trees every once in a while. A few times I thought I heard footsteps, slow, dragging ones, but they never came closer. I tried to sleep, but I kept waking up. Once, I thought I saw a shadow move past the doorway. I sat up and held my breath, listening, but there was nothing. At some point, I did fall asleep. I woke up to a sound I didn't understand right away. It was faint, rhythmic. I sat up in my sleeping bag and listened. It sounded like someone tapping on the wall. 3 slow taps, then silence. Then again 3 taps. I turned on my flashlight and scanned the room. Nothing. I got up and walked toward the sound. It was coming from the back wall, near where the ceiling had caved in. I shone my light up toward the hole and saw nothing. The tapping stopped. I waited for a minute, then went back to my sleeping bag. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, I had made up my mind to leave. I packed up quickly and stepped outside into the damp air. The woods were quiet, too quiet. I noticed something odd right away. There were boot prints in the dirt outside the cabin. Fresh ones. They led around the side of the building and disappeared into the woods. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. My skin went cold. I hadn't seen or heard anyone. I hadn't passed another hiker on the way up. There was no vehicle at the trailhead besides mine. Whoever had left those prints had been watching. I should have left then. I should have turned around and gone home. But something made me stay. I don't know if it was curiosity or stupidity. I told myself I'd stay one more day, look around, try to figure out what was going on. That afternoon, I walked the area around the cabin, following the tracks as best I could. They were old military-style boots, heavy tread, the kind my uncle used to wear. They led in a wide arc through the trees, looping around the cabin before heading deeper into the woods. I followed them for nearly a mile before they disappeared into a patch of rocky ground. But by then, I was too far in to turn back. I kept going, checking the ground for signs, listening. And then I found something I hadn't seen before. A clearing I didn't remember. It was about 30 feet wide, ringed with trees. In the middle was a fire pit, long cold, surrounded by stones. There were beer cans scattered around, and a makeshift bench made from an old log. Someone had been using this place. I walked slowly around the clearing. I felt like I was being watched the entire time. At the edge of the trees, I found a tarp strung between 2 branches, partly hidden by brush. Underneath were a few boxes, supplies, cans of food, water bottles, a sleeping bag rolled up tight. Everything looked recent, clean. Someone had been living out here. I didn't touch anything. I backed away slowly and returned to the cabin. That night, I didn't light a fire. I stayed inside, flashlight off, sitting in the dark, listening. I had my hunting knife in my hand. I heard movement in the woods just after midnight. Something walking. I could feel it getting closer. Around 2 a.m., I heard breathing. It was right outside the wall. Slow, heavy breathing, like someone standing there, just waiting. I didn't move. I held my breath and gripped the knife tight. After what felt like an hour, it stopped. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I found something new. A note. It was stuck to the front door with a nail. The paper was yellowed, torn from a notepad. The words were written in block letters, like someone trying to disguise their handwriting. "You shouldn't be here." That was it. I left. I hiked out as fast as I could, heart pounding the whole way. I didn't stop to rest. I didn't look back. I reached my truck by mid-afternoon, got in, and drove without saying a word. I didn't stop for food. I didn't even check my phone until I got home. I still don't know who was out there. I thought about reporting it, but what would I say? Cabin nobody owns. Tracks in the woods. A note. It's not illegal to live out there. Not really. But something about it wasn't right. Something about the way that person moved, the way they watched, how they never showed their face. Like they didn't want me to know if they were a man at all. Just a presence. A few weeks later, I looked up the name of my uncle's friend, the one who disappeared. There wasn't much online. A few mentions in old hunting forums. One guy said he thought the man had gone off the grid. Said he might still be alive somewhere in those woods. I don't know if I believe that, but I do know one thing. Whoever left that note, they knew I was coming before I got there. And I'm never going back. It was early November 2022 when I drove north through rural Pennsylvania. The trees were bare, the air smelled dry and old, and the sky had that pale gray color it gets before the first snow. I'd taken a week off from work because I needed the quiet. Too much had built up in my head over the last few months. Work stress, losing my dad, and the divorce from Andrew that still sometimes hit me in waves when I least expected it. We'd been split for 3 years by then, but something about the cold always brought him to mind. We used to spend our winters up in his family's old cabin near Keating Summit. It was remote, barely on the map, tucked deep in a fold of woods near the Susquehannock State Forest. He inherited it from his uncle, and for the years we were together, we'd drive up there in November just like this. Trunks packed, no reception, no neighbors, just wood smoke and cold coffee and those damn long nights. I hadn't thought about the cabin in a while, not really. But on this particular trip, I found myself heading in that direction. I didn't plan it. I just let the wheel drift. After 2 nights in a motel near Emporium, I kept going. I told myself I was just exploring. I even stopped and took pictures of some creeks and rock formations along the old 46 highway. But I knew where I was headed before I admitted it to myself. I think it was guilt, maybe curiosity. I'm not sure. But I ended up taking the old dirt road that led toward the cabin just before dusk. The sun was sinking behind the hills, casting a reddish gold light over the tops of the trees. That light always made the woods look deeper than they really were, like you could walk in and disappear forever. The road hadn't changed. Same deep ruts, same overgrown edges, same bend near the broken fence where we used to park the car when the snow got too thick. I drove slow. There was no one around, not for miles. I didn't expect anyone to be out there, not this time of year, not this late in the day. And I sure didn't expect anyone to be at the cabin. Andrew had moved to Florida last I heard. When I reached the clearing, I stopped the car. The cabin was still there, half covered in moss and leaves. One of the front shutters had fallen off. The wood was darker than I remembered, warped in places, sagging at the base. But it was still standing. I don't know what came over me, but I shut off the engine and got out. It was cold, colder than it should have been for early November. The wind cut through my coat like it wasn't even there. I wrapped my arms around myself and walked a slow circle around the place. The porch creaked under my feet. I could see my old boot prints in my mind, faint ghosts from years past. The lock on the door was broken, just hanging there. Pushed it open. Inside, it smelled like mold and dust and something else. Like oil, maybe, or something rotting. I held my breath and stepped in. The living room looked almost exactly how we'd left it. The green couch with the broken leg was still against the wall. The wood stove was rusted shut, but intact. Some of the firewood we'd stacked was still in the corner, dry and gray and hollow. I looked around like I was waiting for something to jump out, but nothing did. I stepped further in. The boards groaned under my weight. I walked into the kitchen. A broken plate was on the floor, and some rodent had torn open a bag of flour on the counter. It had spilled out and hardened into a crusty mess. I checked the fridge out of habit, even though the power had clearly been off for a long time. The smell hit me immediately. I shut it fast and backed away. I should have left then, but I didn't. I told myself I'd just look around a little more, just see if anything had changed. I made my way to the back hallway. That's when I noticed the smell again. Stronger this time, not from the kitchen, from the far end of the hall, near the bedroom we used to sleep in. I stopped, listened. Nothing. No wind, no animals, no creaking. Just dead silence. I took a few more steps. The door to the bedroom was closed. That struck me as wrong, because I was almost sure we left it open when we packed up the last time. I didn't remember ever closing it. And Andrew had said he didn't come up here anymore. I hesitated, then put my hand on the knob. It was cold. Pushed it open. The room was dark, but I could still see shapes in the fading light. The bed was still there, stripped of blankets. The dresser we'd hauled up here in pieces was shoved against the far wall. But what made me freeze was the smell. Sharp and metallic, like blood. And then I saw the mattress. It was stained. Deep brown-red blotches that spread across the middle. Sunken in like something heavy had bled out there and never been cleaned. I stepped back, bumping into the doorframe. The hair on my neck stood up. I looked around the room for any other signs, any reason that might make sense. Maybe an animal got in. Maybe someone squatted here and got hurt. But the rest of the room was clean. Too clean. No drag marks, no blood on the floor. Just the mattress. I backed out of the room and shut the door. As I turned to leave, I thought I heard something outside. A rustle, then a thump, then silence. I waited, heart racing. I stood in the hallway, staring at the front door. Something in me, something old and animal, told me to run. I walked quickly through the living room, not looking behind me, and stepped onto the porch. That's when I saw the footprints, fresh ones, in the dirt right below the steps. They led from the woods to the cabin and stopped just under the porch. The shape was clear boots, heavy ones, bigger than mine, maybe size 12 or 13. I hadn't seen them when I arrived. They weren't there. I crouched, trying to see if they went anywhere else. But no, just straight from the woods to the porch. No return trail, no loops, just a straight path to where I was standing. I looked up and scanned the tree line. Nothing moved, but I felt like I was being watched, like whoever made those prints hadn't left. I backed toward the car. I didn't turn around. I kept my eyes on the trees. I reached the driver's side door, opened it fast, and got in. Locked the doors. Started the engine. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped the keys. I didn't peel out. I just backed up slowly and turned onto the trail. I didn't want to kick up dust or attract attention. I drove 5 miles before I looked in the rearview mirror. I didn't see anyone. When I finally got back to the main road, I pulled over at a gas station. It was empty, just a little place with one pump and a dark convenience store. I sat there for a while, heart still racing. I thought about calling someone. The police, maybe. Reporting the blood. But I didn't even know what I'd say. I'd broken into my ex-husband's old cabin, found a blood-soaked mattress, and saw footprints. I'd be the one answering questions. And Andrew hadn't been there in years. He was clean. I was sure of it. Still, something about it didn't sit right. Something about the footprints. How fresh they were. How silent the woods had been. How strong that smell had been in the room. Couldn't sleep that night. I drove back to the motel in Emporium and kept all the lights on. I locked the door, pushed a chair under the handle, and sat awake until morning. The next day, I made a call. Not to the police, no. I called a friend of Andrew's, someone I knew still lived nearby. I didn't say much, just asked if he'd been up to the cabin lately. She paused for a long time before she answered. She said Andrew died 6 months ago. Motorcycle accident in Florida. Single vehicle, wet road. Died instantly. I didn't know what to say. I thanked her and hung up. Then I sat there, staring at the phone. Andrew was dead. The cabin was empty. So who left those footprints? My name is Mark Lambert, and I was 36 years old when this happened. It was October 2018. I'd just gotten back from a long project overseas, construction work in Norway, and I needed some quiet time away from people, noise, and schedules. I live in eastern Colorado near Limon, but I didn't want to stay anywhere near home. I wanted somewhere isolated. I'd always liked Wyoming because of how empty and quiet it could be. So I started searching around online for cabins to rent up in the Bighorn Mountains. I didn't want anything fancy, just 4 walls, a bed, and a roof. I found one that looked perfect on a classified ad site. Small, deep in the forest, no cell service, no electricity. Just a wood stove, a spring nearby, and a shed full of firewood. It was listed by a man named Dwayne, though I never met him. Everything was done over email. He said he didn't live nearby and I could just send a deposit and he'd leave the door unlocked. I wired him the money and got a short reply with the address and directions. That was it. No waiver, no fancy listing. Just an old-school transaction with a guy who didn't care what I did, as long as I left the place clean and didn't burn it down. I liked that. I was looking for somewhere where no one would check in on me, somewhere I could be truly alone for a while. I packed my truck with food, water jugs, a couple of books, a hunting knife, a rifle, some extra fuel, and some basic tools in case something broke. I took my old dog, Blue, with me. He was a 12-year-old black lab mix, slower than he used to be, but still sharp. He'd been my shadow since he was a pup, and I trusted him more than anyone. We drove up early in the morning, took about 10 hours to get there, all the way into the Bighorns. The last few miles were on a dirt road that hadn't been maintained in years. I had to go slow, bouncing over rocks and roots, but I finally got there just as the sun was setting. The cabin was better than I expected. Old but solid, hand-built from thick logs. Just one room inside with a cot in the corner, a table and chair, some hooks on the wall, and a wood stove in the center. There was a tiny root cellar under a trapdoor, and a shed out back stuffed with chopped logs and kindling. I filled the jugs at the spring nearby and settled in that first night with a fire going and Blue curled up at my feet. There wasn't a sound outside, just the wind moving through the trees. The first couple of days were exactly what I'd hoped for. I slept long hours, made simple meals, read my books, and hiked around during the day with Blue. No one around for miles. I didn't see a single other person. The air was clean, the nights were cold, and I started to feel like I could breathe again after years of noise and pressure. Felt like I'd finally found the space I needed. But on the 4th night, something changed. It was late, probably around 2 or 3 in the morning. I woke up for no reason, just sat straight up in the cot like something had tapped me on the shoulder. Blue was already awake, which was strange. He was lying next to the door, ears up, not growling, not barking, just alert, staring at the door. The fire had burned down to coals, so the cabin was dark, and all I could hear was wind. I waited. A full minute passed. Then I heard something move outside. It wasn't loud, just a soft crunch, like a footstep in dry pine needles. Then another one, then nothing. I slowly got up and stepped over to the window, which was just a small square of glass in a wooden frame. The moon was out, and it lit up the clearing around the cabin just enough to see shapes. There was something just at the edge of the tree line, not moving, not walking away, just standing there. It was far enough away that I couldn't see detail, but it looked wrong. Tall, skinny, too skinny, like a man but stretched. No visible face, just long limbs and shoulders that looked narrow and angled. I thought maybe it was a moose at first, or maybe an elk standing upright on a slope, but it wasn't shaped right. And it wasn't moving, just standing still, looking at the cabin. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, waiting for it to go away, but it didn't move. It didn't make a sound, just stood there like it was waiting for something. I finally lit a lantern and put it near the window, hoping the light would scare it off. When I looked again, it was gone. just trees now. I watched for another hour and then went back to the cot. Blue didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I walked out to the spot where I'd seen it. There were no tracks. The pine needles were thick and soft, but even then, I expected to see some kind of disturbance. Nothing, just the same as it always looked. I told myself it was probably a deer that had wandered close, or maybe a tree that just looked like a shape in the moonlight. I wanted to believe that, but Blue didn't act like it was a deer, and he'd seen 1,000 deer in his life. He knew the difference. That day, I hiked farther than usual, trying to burn off the nerves. I followed a trail up a ridge where I could see for miles. Nothing but trees and mountains. No cabins, no campsites, no signs of people. I didn't even see any wildlife. It was like the whole forest had gone quiet. When I got back to the cabin around dusk, I found something strange. On the door frame, just above the handle, were 3 scratches. Long, narrow, deep. Not from an animal. Not claw marks. These were thin and straight. More like they'd been made by a knife or a sharp stick. I hadn't noticed them that morning, and I was sure they weren't there before. I ran my finger down one of the grooves. It was fresh. I spent that night with the lantern lit, the rifle on my lap, and Blue sitting upright by the stove. Neither of us slept. By the 6th day, I knew something was watching us. It didn't come close every night. Sometimes I saw nothing, but the feeling didn't leave. The silence felt heavier. I stopped hearing birds. Even the wind didn't seem to move the same. And Blue was always on edge. Tail low, ears twitching, eyes scanning the tree line like he was waiting for something to come out of it. I found more signs, small ones. A set of tracks near the spring, bare feet, but wrong. The toes were too long. The arch was strange, like a person, but not quite. Another day, I found a dead rabbit near the shed. Not eaten, just killed. Neck broken, body untouched, like it had been dropped there as a message. I buried it behind the cabin and didn't tell Blue. I thought about leaving. I packed everything up twice, but I stayed. I told myself I was imagining it, that maybe it was all just isolation getting to my head. I hadn't spoken to a person in over a week. I thought maybe I was going crazy, but then came the night it tried the door. It was just after midnight. I was lying on the cot with the rifle beside me, eyes open, heart pounding, for no real reason. Blue was sleeping lightly, breathing slow but twitching. Then he sat up, ears up, growling low in his throat. That's when I heard the click. The doorknob turned slowly, not fast, not like someone trying to break in, just a careful, quiet twist. It rattled a little when it hit the deadbolt. Then silence. Blue was snarling now, teeth bared, low and deep. I grabbed the rifle and aimed it at the door. I didn't say a word. I didn't move. I just waited. Then came a sound I'll never forget. A voice, but not a real voice. It sounded like someone trying to mimic a voice, like a recording played through a busted speaker. Croaky, too slow, and it was my name. It said, Marark, once, then nothing. I didn't sleep. I didn't move from that spot. I waited until the sun rose, then went outside. There were tracks again, bare feet, long toes, but now they led in a circle around the cabin. Again and again, like it had been walking in loops for hours. And on the window, written in something dark, were the words, "Let me in." I don't remember packing. I just threw everything into the truck, called Blue, and drove down that awful dirt road faster than I should have. I didn't stop for anything. I drove until I got to the nearest town, and I stayed in a motel with the TV on full volume just to drown out the quiet. I called the number I had for Dwayne. Disconnected. I tried to email him. No reply. I never went back. I never told anyone until now. Not even my brother. I couldn't explain it. I still can't. I don't know what it was, but I know what it wasn't. It wasn't human, and it wasn't an animal. It was something in between, or something pretending to be both. I looked it up later. People talk about things called skinwalkers, old stories, myths. I don't know if that's what it was. All I know is that something was out there, and it wanted me to open that door. But I didn't, and I never will. I don't usually talk about what happened that week. It's been years now, but I still think about it all the time. It was 2017, I was 32, and I had just gone through a messy breakup. I needed to get away for a while, so I took time off work and decided to go spend a week alone in the woods. I wanted quiet.
No phones.
No people. Just trees, fresh air, and some time to clear my head. A buddy of mine, Greg, had a family-owned hunting cabin up near Ely, Minnesota, about 3 hours north of Duluth. It hadn't been used in a while. His uncle used to stay there during hunting season, but after he passed, no one really went back. Greg said I could use it if I wanted, and I did. He gave me the key, showed me roughly where it was on a printed map, and I headed up there the next weekend in my old pickup truck. The last 30 minutes of the drive were rough dirt roads.
No signy.
Just narrow gravel weaving through dense woods. I remember the sky was cloudy that day, the kind of dull gray that makes everything feel colder than it actually is. When I finally reached the cabin, I was relieved. It was small, old, but solid. Thick logs, green tin roof, one chimney, the kind of place built to hold up against winters. There was a small shed behind it with a rusted lock and some old tools scattered around. A hand pump for water, a composting toilet a little down the path. The basics. Inside, it smelled like dry wood and dust. There was a cot, a wood stove, a few shelves with old cans of beans, and a table with 2 chairs. The windows had heavy shutters on the outside. I kept those open during the day but shut them at night. That first night was peaceful. I made a fire, heated some canned chili, and sat outside on the small porch, listening to the wind move through the trees. No phone signal, no internet.
No voices.
Just me and the woods. I slept hard that night, the kind of sleep you only get after driving all day and not seeing another soul for hours. The next few days passed slowly, which was what I wanted. I read a bit, chopped wood, and took long walks through the trees. I wasn't much of a hunter or fisherman, so I stuck to dry food and boiled water. I had a radio, but all I could get were fuzzy weather reports and some religious station that played organ music. It was on the 4th day that things started to feel strange. I had walked farther than usual, heading east through some older woods. The trees got tighter, taller. The trail disappeared. I came across what looked like an old logging road, mostly grown over. There were broken branches, deep tire ruts half swallowed by moss, and an old rusted barrel tipped on its side. I remember thinking it was odd, like no one had been out here in decades. As I stood there, looking around, I heard what sounded like a faint crunch, like something stepping on dry leaves behind me. I turned, expecting maybe a deer or even a bear, but there was nothing, just trees and silence. I stood there for a while, listening. I didn't see anything move. Still, I felt unsettled. Something about the place just felt wrong. I headed back to the cabin a little quicker than usual. That night, I kept the shutters closed tight. I chalked it up to being alone in unfamiliar woods. Your brain starts playing tricks. You hear things, see things in the corners of your eye. But the next day, things escalated. I found footprints, human ones. They were in the dirt behind the cabin, near the back wall where the stacked wood sat. At first I thought maybe they were mine, but the tread didn't match my boots. These were thinner, longer. I followed them a bit. They curved around the side of the cabin and disappeared into the woods. The weird part was they were fresh. The edges were sharp, not weathered or washed. Someone had been near the cabin either late that night or early that morning. I felt something shift in my chest. Not fear, not yet, but unease. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat by the stove for a while. I kept looking out the window. I told myself it was probably a hunter or hiker passing through. But the thing was, this area wasn't near any trails, and that road I came in on was the only one for miles. That night, I slept with the axe next to my bed. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a noise outside. It was slow, deliberate. A crunch, then a pause, then another crunch. Someone walking on the gravel outside the cabin. Not fast, not stumbling, just moving steadily, like they were checking the place out. I didn't move. I just listened, barely breathing. My ears were burning from how hard I was straining to hear. The steps got closer to the wall. Then they stopped. Nothing. I sat there in the dark for what felt like an hour, not hearing anything more. Eventually, I worked up the nerve to peek through a crack in the shutters. The porch was empty. The trees were still. No movement. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I checked around the cabin again. More footprints, this time right on the porch. Someone had walked up to the door and stood there.
No knock.
Just stood. I couldn't think of a reason for it. There weren't any nearby properties, no neighbors, and it wasn't hunting season. I felt exposed. I packed some of my things into the truck, but I didn't leave yet. I told myself I was being paranoid, overreacting. That afternoon, I walked a wide circle around the cabin, trying to see if I could find where the tracks led to. I went about half a mile into the woods and found something strange. It was a makeshift shelter. Branches leaned against a tree, with tarps and old cloths tied together to form a kind of lean-to. Inside were some rotting blankets, a few cans of food, and an old backpack. It looked abandoned, but not for long. The blankets weren't soaked, and there were footprints around it. Same tread as the ones near the cabin. I didn't touch anything. I just backed away and headed straight for the cabin. That night, I didn't light the fire. I kept all the lights off and sat in the dark with the axe in my lap, listening. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they circled the cabin. Slow, even. Gravel crunching, then soft grass. Then gravel again, like whoever it was knew the layout. At one point, they stopped right behind the wall where I was sitting. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I waited. A full minute passed. Then 2. Nothing. Then the footsteps moved away, slow and quiet. The next morning, I made the decision to leave. I loaded the truck, locked up the cabin, and started heading down the dirt road. About 5 minutes in, I saw a figure standing by the side of the road ahead. At first, I thought it was a deer the way it was frozen. But as I got closer, I saw it was a man. He was tall, thin, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. His face was pale, expressionless. He didn't wave. He didn't step forward. Just stood there, staring. I didn't stop. I kept driving, heart pounding, gripping the wheel tighter than I ever had in my life. I didn't look back. When I finally hit pavement again, I felt like I could breathe for the first time in days. I reported what I saw to the local sheriff's office, just in case. They didn't seem too surprised. The deputy I spoke to just wrote down my info and nodded a lot. He said they occasionally had people squatting out in the woods, off-grid types. Some of them were harmless. Some weren't. I never went back to that cabin. Greg didn't blame me. In fact, he ended up selling the land a year later. Said it wasn't worth the weird stories he kept hearing from hunters up that way. Even now, years later, I still think about that man. About how he walked around the cabin like he was studying it. About how he never knocked, never spoke, never showed himself fully. Just lingered, close enough to be heard, seen from the corner of your eye, but never enough to confront. I've camped since then, but never alone, and never anywhere without a way out. People say the woods are peaceful, and they can be, But they also hide things, people who don't want to be found. And if you're not careful, you might find them anyway, or they might find you. It had been almost 12 years since I last saw the old farm in Kentucky. I'd grown up out there, dirt roads, rusted tractors, cattle gates, and endless stretches of soybean fields. The kind of place where the air always smelled like earth, rain, or diesel. My Uncle Mike owned the land after my grandfather passed. I used to help him on weekends when I was a teenager, mostly odd jobs around the property, cutting firewood, patching fences, feeding the animals. I hadn't been back since I was 19. It was late August of 2022 when I got the call. Mike had died in a car accident. I hadn't seen or spoken to him in years, but the lawyer said the land had been left to me.
À surprise.
I didn't feel much, maybe some guilt. The farm had always felt like a piece of me I'd buried under years of city living. My job in Indianapolis was stable but dull. So when I took a week off to head back to the farm and look over what I'd inherited, I figured it'd just be some legal work, a few trips down memory lane, and maybe a quiet night or two in the old cabin. I didn't expect anything strange. The drive down took 6 hours. As I got off the highway and started cutting through smaller roads, it felt like time folded back on itself. Long rows of corn, rusty mailboxes, beat-up pickup trucks parked by fences that sagged under the weight of decades. The last stretch was gravel. I turned off onto County Road 14, a road barely wider than my rental's wheels, and followed it until the trees opened up and I saw the cabin again. It looked smaller than I remembered. The roof sagged slightly, the wood had gone gray with age, and the windows were covered with grime and pollen. Still, it stood. The barn was behind it, still painted red but faded and chipped. 2 silos loomed beyond that, both dented, one with a rusted-out hole big enough to crawl through. I parked near the old well. The air was still, heavy with humidity. Not a single bird call. I walked up to the porch, the boards creaked just like they used to. The key the lawyer mailed me worked. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust and old wood. Everything was just like Mike had left it. A coat hanging by the door, coffee mugs on the counter, a toolbox open on the table. It looked like he'd just stepped outside. I wandered through the rooms, turning on lights, opening drawers. The fridge was off but clean. His old rifle still hung on the wall. I stayed the first night out of convenience. There was no cell service, but I had downloaded maps and saved a few emergency contacts. I figured if anything happened, I could drive 10 minutes down the road to the gas station. That night was quiet, too quiet. I didn't sleep much. There were sounds, small, irregular, like shifting boards or scurrying mice. But it wasn't just the noise. It was the stillness, the way the air felt like it didn't move inside the cabin. I chalked it up to nerves. City people get uneasy in rural silence. The next morning, I started walking the property. The fields were overgrown. It must have been years since Mike had planted anything. The tractor was parked beside the barn, half covered in a blue tarp, tires flat. I walked the fence line for a while. A few posts had collapsed. Some of the wire had rusted through. The pond was still there, though smaller than I remembered, with algae gathered around the edges and flies buzzing over the surface. When I reached the barn, the first thing I noticed was that the side door had been nailed shut from the outside. For large nails driven in at odd angles, like someone had done it in a hurry. The front doors were still locked with a chain, and I used the key to get inside. The air was thick with dust and straw, the floor covered in dry manure and cracked boards. Most of the stalls were empty. One had some tools, another had what looked like a pile of blankets or old feed bags shoved in the corner. I poked around a bit, found some old ledgers, and a row of empty feed bins. Nothing unusual, but the nailed door stayed in the back of my mind. I ended up pulling the nails out with a crowbar from the shed and checking inside. It was just another empty stall. Nothing but a few splinters and some broken boards. But it still felt wrong, like someone had wanted that space sealed off. I let it go. By the third day, I started sleeping better. I even thought I might stay longer than a week. Maybe get the place cleaned up, fixed up. Maybe even sell it for decent money. But that night, something changed. It was just after midnight when I heard the footsteps. I'd left the bedroom window open to let in the breeze. It had finally cooled down. I was drifting off when I heard it, gravel shifting, like someone walking near the porch, then wood creaking, the same sound I'd heard when I arrived. I sat up, heart already pounding. I waited. Nothing. I thought maybe it was an animal, a deer, maybe a raccoon. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside. Nothing on the porch. I walked around the side. The flashlight beam bounced across the grass, the trees, the shed. Then I saw it. Footprints. They weren't mine. These were fresher, darker, leading up the steps and then back down. I followed them, heart thumping so loud it made my teeth hurt. The tracks stopped near the barn. I stood there a long time, shining the light across the doors. The chain was still locked. I circled around. The side door was shut, but the nails were back. That didn't make sense. I had pulled those nails myself, tossed them into the pile by the door. Now they were hammered back in. Same holes, same angle. Like someone had been watching. Like someone didn't want that door open again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the kitchen with the rifle on the table. Every light in the house turned on. I listened, but heard nothing more. The next morning, I went back to the barn. The side door was nailed shut, just like I'd seen. I pulled the nails again, but this time I checked the stall top to bottom. The floorboards were rough but solid. There were scratch marks on the inside, deep and erratic, like someone had dragged a metal tool or claw across the wood. In the corner was something I hadn't noticed before. A square patch of dirt, loose and dry, unlike the rest of the compacted barn floor. I started digging with a spade. About a foot down, I hit metal. It was a box, rusted, old. I dragged it out, opened it. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, some torn, some faded. All of them were of the farm. A few showed the pond. One showed a group of men in coveralls standing in front of the barn, none of whom I recognized. Then there was a picture of the stall. The same stall, the side door wide open. Something lay on the floor, but the photo was too dark to make it out. Another photo was clearer. It showed a man, tied up, bloodied, face swollen. Inside the stall, there were more, all in that same stall. Different men, different days, all tied, beaten, some half-naked. Some looked unconscious. One looked dead. I dropped the box and ran back to the cabin. I don't remember how long I stood under the shower. I couldn't stop shaking. I had no idea what I was dealing with, but I started connecting things. The nails, the silence, Mike's sudden death, the fact that he never let anyone visit, the old freezer I hadn't opened yet in the shed. I called the sheriff's office from the gas station down the road. They said they'd send someone the next day. That night, I didn't go back to the cabin. I slept in the car with the doors locked. When the deputy showed up, I handed over everything, the photos, the box, showed him the stall. He took it all, wrote up a report, promised they'd bring in a forensics team, told me not to go back inside the cabin until they were done with the scene. Turned into a full investigation. Over the next week, I stayed in town. The papers didn't say much, just that human remains had been found on private property. But I heard things from locals, rumors, stories about drifters disappearing near the county lines, about screams in the night that people had written off as coyotes. Turns out Mike wasn't who I thought he was. Nobody knew what he'd been doing all those years. But the land had secrets, and he'd buried them deep, literally. I sold the farm to the state. They fenced it off, turned it into a restricted zone for a while. I didn't ask what they found beyond the barn. I didn't want to know. I went back to Indianapolis and never looked back. I still have nightmares. Not about the photos, not about the box. About the nails. The way they were driven in again. The way someone or something had been watching me the whole time. Whatever was buried there, whatever Mike did, it wasn't gone. It was just waiting. My name's Daniel Hughes. I was 35 when this happened, though I felt older by the end of it. At the time, I was a freelance land surveyor, mostly working in remote areas around upstate New York. The job was never glamorous, but it paid enough for me to live a quiet life, which was all I wanted. In the fall of 2017, I accepted a private job from a small law firm out of Albany. They were handling a weird inheritance case and needed someone to map a property boundary out near Franklin County, about 2 hours south of the Canadian border. The job seemed simple enough: drive out, spend a day or two walking the land, double-check some historical markers, and report back. The odd part was where they put me up. The land they wanted me to survey sat on the edge of an old burial plot that hadn't been used in decades, except for a handful of local families that still owned rights to the ground. Right beside that graveyard, maybe 50 yards out, sat a one-story wooden cabin. According to the paperwork, it had belonged to some Civil War-era family, but no one had lived in it for at least 20 years. No electricity.
No plumbing.
Just a roof for walls and a wood stove. The law firm told me they had gotten permission to use it as a base for the survey since it sat directly on the disputed edge of the property. I didn't love the idea of staying out there, especially not that close to a graveyard, but I'd done worse. The firm promised a bonus if I stayed at the cabin and finished the job in 3 days. So I packed my gear, grabbed a cooler full of food, and drove north. The gravel road leading to the place was barely a road at all. Overgrown trees crowded in on both sides, and I had to drive with my windows down just to make sure I didn't scrape up the sides of my truck. The sun was already dropping behind the hills when I pulled up in front of the cabin. It was exactly what I expected. Weather-beaten, slanted porch, rusted hinges, a front door that creaked like an old church pew. The grass around it had turned to yellow patches, and the weeds were thick enough to hide small animals. I parked, got out, and stood there for a while, just taking it in. The graveyard wasn't far behind it. I could see the tops of the stones poking through a rise in the hill. Most of them were crooked, weather-worn, covered in moss. Some were nothing but slabs of rock without names. There were no fences or gates, just open ground. A few twisted trees leaned over the graves like they were hanging their heads. The whole place had a forgotten feel to it, like time had skipped over this patch of land. I unlocked the cabin door with the old key the firm had mailed me. Stuck a little, but eventually gave way. Inside, it smelled like dust, sap, and old ash. There were a few pieces of broken furniture, an armchair missing a leg, a table with a warped top, and a twin bed frame nailed to the back wall. A pile of dry logs sat beside the old cast iron stove. I lit a lantern, set up my sleeping bag on the floor, and started a small fire to knock the cold out of the air. It was quiet in that way only deep woods can be. No cars, no people, just the wind in the trees. The first night was uneventful. I ate a sandwich, checked my gear, marked out the survey area on a map, and wrote down the GPS coordinates I'd need. Around midnight, I stepped out onto the porch to stretch my legs and take a leak. The moon was high, casting long shadows through the trees. The graveyard looked like a field of stones caught in the act of falling over.
No lights. No sounds.
Just stillness. But as I turned to go back inside, I had the strangest feeling that someone was watching me. Not from the graveyard, closer than that. I swept my flashlight across the woods. Nothing moved. I waited, listened, then went back in and locked the door. I didn't sleep much after that. The second day was work. I hiked the eastern edge of the property, hammering in orange boundary markers every few hundred feet. It was a cold morning, and the frost made the grass crackle under my boots. Around noon, I stopped at the edge of a creek that cut across the back of the lot. The water was clear and cold, and animal tracks crowded the muddy banks. I was crouched down, checking the soil depth, when I noticed a trail of boot prints on the far side. Deep, fresh, leading in a straight line along the creek and disappearing into the woods. They weren't mine. I hadn't seen anyone else for miles, and there were no other vehicles when I arrived. I stood up, followed the prints with my eyes, but the trees closed around them quick. I made a mental note and moved on. Didn't think much of it at the time. Just figured maybe a local hunter or someone had wandered through. By the time I got back to the cabin, the sun was already low. The graveyard looked different in the evening light, less sad and more unsettled, like the ground had shifted just slightly. I told myself it was nothing, just the long shadows playing tricks. Still, I kept the cabin door locked that night, double-checked the windows, and slept with the hatchet close by. Sometime after 2 a.m., I heard movement outside. At first, it was just the sound of dry leaves brushing against the cabin wall. Then came a low, deliberate crunch, footsteps, slow and careful. My eyes snapped open. The fire in the stove had gone low, and the room was lit only by the glow of embers. I didn't move. I listened. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. The steps stopped right outside the door. I held my breath and sat up, slow and quiet. The hatchet was under my sleeping bag. I grabbed it and waited, muscles tight.
No knock.
No voice, just silence. Then something brushed against the wooden siding. Not hard, just enough to scrape. I got to my feet and stood in the middle of the room. 10 minutes passed, then 20. No more sounds. I waited until daylight before opening the door. Nothing there.
No prints. No marks.
But I knew what I'd heard. I almost left that morning. Something felt wrong. The air had changed. But I was almost done with the job, and the extra bonus for finishing early pushed me to stay. I told myself I was being paranoid, maybe just spooked by the isolation. I spent the third day finishing the north side of the property. There were more boot prints, this time circling a marker I'd driven into the ground the day before. Not crossing through, not by accident. Circling it, like someone had stood there a while. I worked faster after that, kept looking over my shoulder. I wanted out. Around dusk, I hiked back toward the cabin, and that's when I saw it. One of the grave markers near the top of the hill was broken. I'm not talking about old age or erosion. I mean shattered, split down the center like someone had taken a sledgehammer to it. The pieces were clean, sharp, and fresh. Chunks of granite scattered in the dirt. No animals could have done that. I checked the rest of the graveyard. One of the smaller stones had been dug around, like someone started to excavate it, then stopped. The soil was still loose. No shovel marks, just scooped dirt and a small pile to the side. I didn't stay long. Back at the cabin, I packed up everything I could carry. I wasn't waiting for sunrise. I just wanted out. But when I turned the key in the ignition, my truck didn't start. Battery was fine. Lights came on. But when I turned the key, it gave a weak click and nothing else. I tried again. Nothing. It was getting dark fast, and I was nearly 10 miles from the nearest house. No cell signal. I sat behind the wheel for a long time, trying to decide whether to hike out in the dark or wait till morning. That's when I saw movement near the treeline. Just a flicker of motion at first, barely noticeable, but then a figure stepped into view. A man. He stood maybe 30 feet from the truck. Tall, thin, wearing a dark jacket and what looked like rubber boots. His face was pale in the fading light, and he just stood there, arms at his sides, not moving. I didn't get out. I locked the doors, slid down in my seat, and waited. After a few minutes, I peeked up. He was gone. I bolted for the cabin, locked the door, and didn't sleep at all that night. Morning took forever to come. When it did, I went outside, checked the truck again. Same thing, lights worked, engine wouldn't turn. I tried the hood. The battery cable had been cut. Clean, precise, like with wire cutters. I grabbed my backpack and started walking. Didn't even look back at the cabin. 10 miles through brush and frost, carrying 40 pounds of gear, constantly checking behind me. By the time I reached the highway, it was almost noon. A passing driver gave me a lift to the sheriff's office in Tupper Lake. I told them someone had vandalized the graves and tampered with my truck. They sent a deputy out to check. He came back 3 hours later, said the graveyard looked fine. No broken stones, no dug up ground,
No footprints.
my truck was still there, dead, but the battery cable looked untouched. He chalked it up to stress, isolation, overactive imagination. I didn't argue. I just wanted to go home. 3 weeks later, I got a check in the mail. Full payment plus the bonus. No note, no follow-up. Just a typed envelope from the law firm and a deposit slip. I tried looking up the property again, wanted to know who inherited it. But the listing was gone, wiped clean. No record in the county archives. No tax ID. Nothing. I stopped working remote jobs after that. Sold the truck. Moved closer to town. Got an office job. But sometimes, I still dream about that man. The one who stood by the trees. The way he didn't move. The way he watched. I know what I saw, even if no one else believes it. I was 34 when I finally took time off work to spend a week alone at my uncle's old hunting cabin up in the hills of eastern Oregon. It was the first real break I'd had in years. I worked long shifts managing a concrete crew out of Eugene, and by the time fall rolled around in 2018, I needed to breathe something other than dust and diesel. My uncle had passed away 3 years earlier, and the cabin had just been sitting up there empty. No one in the family hunted much anymore, but I still liked the quiet. I packed up my .270, a few coolers of food, a gas lantern, some dry firewood, and left town early on a Monday morning. The road to the cabin was just as rough as I remembered it from when I was a kid. The last few miles were nothing but a rutted dirt track that wound up through thick timber and overgrown brush. I had to slow to a crawl to keep my truck from bottoming out. It was already late October, and I knew the weather could flip fast out there. That week looked clear though, cold but dry, and I figured I'd be fine so long as I didn't stay past the weekend. The cabin sat near the edge of a shallow ridge, tucked back under tall lodgepole pines and fir. There was an old hand pump well next to it, a rusted steel drum for burning trash, and a small woodshed off to one side. The structure itself was solid but weathered. It had been built back in the 60s by my uncle and grandfather, tight cedar planks, a tin roof, and a little front porch with 2 cracked chairs. Inside it was one open room, a wood stove, a cot, some shelves, and a battered old table. Smelled like dry wood, mice, and dust. I spent the first day getting settled. I swept out rat droppings, knocked down spider webs, and made sure the stove still worked. It fired up fine. The pump water was cold and metallic but clean. I unloaded my gear and stacked firewood inside just in case the weather turned. That evening, I sat on the porch with a thermos of coffee, listening to the wind roll through the trees. I hadn't seen another truck since the main road. Just me, the woods, and the quiet. The first 2 days were calm. I woke early, dressed warm, and hiked out into the trees before sunrise. I'd picked a few old logging cuts about a mile east of the cabin to glass from. There were tracks, elk, deer, coyote, but I didn't shoot anything. I didn't care much. felt good just being out there, breathing the air, taking my time. I stayed out till early afternoon, then headed back to cook, chop more wood, and read. I didn't bring my phone, and there was no signal even if I had. No service out there at all. It was on the third day that something shifted. That morning I hiked farther north than usual, trying to reach a small draw I remembered from my younger days. It took longer than I thought, and the sun was already high when I stopped on a rocky rise to scan the trees below. I glassed for nearly an hour before turning back. I was still about half a mile from the cabin when I cut across a small meadow I hadn't seen before. It looked like it had been cleared recently. The stumps were fresh, pine bark still red where the saws had bit into them. There were deep tire ruts in the soft ground, and I could see where something heavy had been dragged. Long scrapes in the dirt like a sled or maybe logs chained behind a truck. I crouched by one of the drag marks. It wasn't a log. There were scuffed boot prints around it. Deep, messy impressions like someone had been struggling. Something about it didn't sit right. There were broken branches scattered across the clearing and a few scraps of tarp. Blue plastic, torn and dirty. I stood up and scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. I walked the perimeter once, slow and careful, then left. I didn't sleep much that night. The cabin creaked with the wind, and I kept thinking about that meadow. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Some guys clearing timber illegally, maybe, but the drag marks were wide and deep, too deep for just logs. And the boot prints didn't look like work boots. They were old, worn soles barely gripping the mud. Something about it reminded me of a memory I couldn't quite place, like the smell of something bad behind a closed door. I woke up around 2:30 in the morning and thought I heard a truck in the distance. Just a faint rumble that faded before I could sit up fully. I waited, holding my breath. The wind was still. The trees were quiet. Nothing moved. I laid there in my cot with one hand on my rifle till the sky lightened. The next day, I didn't go far. I stayed within earshot of the cabin, chopping wood, walking slow laps around the area, looking for anything that felt off. I didn't find much, but around noon, I noticed the burn barrel had been moved slightly. It wasn't where I'd left it. There were fresh scratches on the ground around its base, and the lid, an old hubcap, was gone. I hadn't touched it since arriving. No animal would mess with something that heavy. I walked a wide circle through the trees but didn't see anything else. Still, I loaded my rifle that night and kept it beside me in the cot. The next morning, I woke up to boot prints on the porch. They were old boots, wide tread, worn at the heel. Not mine. They came from the woods and ended right in front of the door. They didn't go back. Whoever it was had walked up while I slept and stood there for a while, then disappeared. My skin went cold. I scanned the trees for 20 minutes, then stepped out with my rifle raised and did a full perimeter check. Nothing. I followed the prints about 20 feet into the trees before they vanished into hard ground. No tire tracks, no sound, no other signs. That day I stayed inside. I kept the fire low, blocked the windows, and listened. Around noon, I heard a single creak from the woodshed out back. Just one, like weight shifting on an old board. I stepped out fast, rifle ready, but no one was there. Still, I didn't go back in. I packed everything I could into the truck and sat in the driver's seat until dark. I didn't leave, though. I don't know why. Maybe I thought I was being paranoid. Maybe I didn't want to believe that someone had come to the cabin in the middle of the night just to stand and watch. But I didn't sleep that night either. At 3:20 a.m., I heard the pump handle move. Just once. A single metallic squeak like someone testing it. Then silence. I held the rifle tight and didn't move till the sun came up. That was the last straw. I started the truck before dawn and headed down the trail. I didn't stop to eat, didn't check the well, didn't sweep the cot or res-tack the wood. I was 10 minutes down the trail when I came across fresh tracks. Deep ruts, tire marks from a wide, heavy vehicle, possibly a flatbed. They weren't there when I arrived. They were still wet in places. Someone had come up the night before or early that morning. I followed them for another mile and saw where they turned off into the brush, through a break in the trees. I didn't follow. I made it to the main road by noon and kept driving all the way back to Eugene without stopping. Back home, I told myself it was nothing, just poachers or maybe someone squatting near the woods. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was, they weren't just passing through. They'd come all the way up that trail to stand on my porch and watch me. They didn't knock. They didn't take anything. They just watched. 2 weeks later, I filed a report with the county, just in case. They sent someone up. The deputy said he didn't see anything unusual. The cabin was fine, but the woodshed door had been torn off its hinges. Not pried, torn. They never found who did it. I never went back. I still hunt, but only in state land near town with other people around. I think about that trip every time I hear a creak at night or see a footprint where there shouldn't be one. I'll never know what was in that clearing or who walked up to my door in the dark. But I know what I felt, and I trust that more than any report. Something was wrong in those woods, and I should have left the moment I saw that first boot print. I was 39 when I decided to finally build the cabin. My name's Mark Thorne, and this happened in the autumn of 2017, about 15 miles outside a small town in eastern Washington called Larchwood. It's not the kind of place that shows up on maps unless you zoom all the way in. One of those quiet towns built on logging, forgotten rail lines, and stubborn people who never left. I wasn't from there originally. I grew up in Boise, but I'd bought a plot of land in the woods just north of town back in 2011. 6 acres, tucked up a dirt trail, half of it overgrown with fir and pine. It had been cheap. No one wanted to live that far off the grid anymore. I bought the land when I still had a decent job in contracting, and back then the plan was to build a full cabin with electricity, plumbing, the whole deal. Then life rolled over me like a bulldozer. Divorce, then layoffs, then a few years scraping by doing odd jobs. By the time I had enough saved again, I was just looking for something simple. I didn't want to wait anymore. I had some rough plans scribbled out in a notebook, just a one-room shelter, insulated walls, a raised bed platform, a small wood stove, and enough space to store tools and gear. I figured if I started in October, I could get it sealed up before winter. I brought everything in with my old Ford Ranger. Took 5 trips. The final load was mostly lumber and the last of my tools. The plan was to stay up there for a few nights, finish the framing, and get the roof on. I had a weather app, but it didn't help much out there. The rain didn't care about forecasts in the Cascades. It started coming down just as I backed the truck off the trail and onto the clearing I'd carved with a chainsaw the year before. It wasn't a storm at first, just a steady gray drizzle that started before noon. I set up a blue tarp between 2 trees so I could work without getting soaked. I remember hammering the first nails in with a kind of joy I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just building something, it was making space for myself. Not a home exactly, but a place that would be mine. The rain picked up just after sunset. By then, I had the frame for 2 of the walls standing. The third was on the ground, ready to lift. I was too tired to bother with a fire, so I climbed into my truck cab, wrapped up in a sleeping bag, and drifted off to the sound of rain hitting the windshield. That first night was uneventful. The second wasn't. The next morning was colder. A low fog hung between the trees. My breath came out in little clouds, and the ground was soft, thick with needles and soaked dirt. I worked from sunup until almost dark. No music, no podcast, just the hammer, the saw, and the crows. I don't know how long I worked before I noticed it. Probably a few hours. But I started getting the feeling someone had been through the site. I had left some things under the tarp overnight, my tool belt, 2 power tools, a half-full thermos. Nothing was missing, but the tarp was pushed to one side like someone had pulled it back. I told myself the wind had done it, even though the bungee cords were still fastened on one end. I double-checked everything and got back to work. That night, I built a small fire and ate a can of beans on the tailgate of the truck. The rain had let up, but the woods felt heavier than the night before. The trees creaked in the wind, but the air was still. Around 11, I laid back in the cab again, the fire dying out in the pit I'd ringed with stone. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, I woke up. It was that kind of waking where your body just knows something's off. No sound, no sudden movement, just a stillness that wasn't there before. I sat up slowly, and the first thing I noticed was the fire. It was out, not even a glow left in the embers. I looked through the fogged windshield. Everything was dark and wet. My breath caught in my throat when I saw the tarp. It was gone. Not flapping, not blown back. Gone. The trees where it had been tied were still there. The cords were on the ground. I thought about getting out and checking the site, but I didn't move. I told myself some animal had dragged it off. Maybe a bear, but that didn't feel right either. I sat there in the dark until the sky started to lighten. The next morning, I searched all around the clearing. No sign of the tarp. I didn't find tracks, either, not boot prints or paws, just mud and pine needles. I tried to shake it off. I was alone in the woods. Things moved out there. But still, I started working faster, like getting the roof on would make it safer somehow. Around noon, I caught something out of the corner of my eye, just movement between the trees, maybe 50 yards out. I looked straight at it, but there was nothing there. That was the first time I felt watched. I stopped for lunch, sitting with my back against the cabin frame, chewing a peanut butter sandwich. The rain had started again, heavier this time. I was soaked through, but I didn't care. I just wanted to finish. That afternoon, I got the walls up and started nailing in the rafters. Every now and then, I'd hear a snapping twig or a shift in the brush, but nothing ever came close. I kept glancing toward the woods, looking for any sign of deer or other animals. But it was just trees. Always trees. When dusk hit, I decided to sleep in the cabin frame. I pulled the truck around, parked it right next to the wall, and stretched out inside the frame, using a rolled-up coat as a pillow. No roof, no insulation, just open wood and falling rain. Still, I felt better with the walls around me. That night, the sounds were different. I don't mean louder, I mean closer. Something heavy moved just beyond the clearing. I could hear it stop and start, like it was circling. Once or twice, I held my breath and thought I could hear it breathing. Not a bear, not a deer. It was slow and deliberate. Around midnight, I heard a crunch, like a boot on dead wood. I didn't move. I just lay there, eyes open, the hammer clutched in my hand. The sound stopped, and everything went quiet again. When I got up the next morning, I checked the clearing again. Still no footprints, no sign of anything, but about 20 feet from the cabin, just at the edge of the trees, I saw something hanging from a low branch. It was a strip of my tarp, frayed at one end, about 3 feet long. It had been tied in a knot. Not an accident, not weather, asterisk tied. Asterisk someone had done that. I stared at it for a long time, trying to think of any reason someone would do that. Was it a hunter? A hiker messing around? But this far out? I hadn't seen another person in 3 days. No trucks on the trail.
No voices.
Just that strip of tarp, swaying in the breeze. I untied it, took it down, and stuffed it in my pack. I didn't tell myself anything anymore. I just kept working. That day, I finished the rafters and started laying down the roof boards. I worked through the rain, slipping once and bruising my side on a rafter beam. I didn't stop. I just wanted to close it in. By nightfall, the roof was half covered. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the truck with the doors locked and a flashlight in one hand, hammer in the other. I thought I heard breathing again, but maybe it was the wind in the trees. Maybe I was cracking. At dawn, I packed everything into the truck. I nailed in the last roof boards as fast as I could, threw a tarp over the open section, and called it good. I didn't want to be there another night. I started the truck, drove down the trail, and didn't stop until I hit the main road. I didn't go back for 4 weeks. It was early December when I returned. I brought a friend with me that time, Jason, an old coworker who liked hunting and didn't ask questions. We went up together in his SUV with tools and supplies. The plan was to finish insulating the cabin and install the stove. I didn't tell him what happened before. I just said I needed a second set of hands. When we got to the site, I noticed 2 things right away. First, the roof tarp had been removed, not blown off, but taken down neatly and folded beside the wall. Second, there was a pile of small rocks in front of the cabin door, each one about the size of a fist, stacked into a little pyramid. 6 high. Jason thought it was a joke. I didn't say anything. We finished the roof and bolted the stove into place. That night, we lit a fire inside, laid down some sleeping pads and tried to sleep. But I couldn't, not after what I saw just before dark. In the trees at the far end of the clearing, there was a figure. I didn't say a word. I just stood by the doorway watching. It didn't move. I couldn't make out details, just the shape. Tall, still, almost blending into the trees. I turned to get Jason, and when I looked back, it was gone. I never told him. The next day, we left early. The cabin was finished, weathertight, sturdy, a good place, but I never stayed there again. Sometimes, late at night, I still see that figure in my mind just beyond the trees. I think about the tarp, the rocks, the breathing. I still don't know who or what was out there, but I know one thing for sure. I wasn't alone. I never was. It was the fall of 1997 when I decided to take a break from the noise of the city. I was 28 then, living a cramped life in a small apartment on the edge of Seattle. The days were getting shorter, the air colder, and the trees outside my window were turning burnt orange and gold. I wanted to get away, clear my head, and spend some time with my dog. A sturdy German shepherd named Max. Max had been with me for almost 6 years. A loyal, calm companion who never left my side. I found a cabin online, a small, weathered building about 3 hours east of town, nestled in the Cascade Mountains. It was owned by an old friend's uncle who hadn't used it in years. The cabin was simple, wooden walls, a stone fireplace, a small porch with a view of a thick pine forest. No electricity, no phone signal, no running water except from a nearby creek. Exactly what I needed. The morning I left, the sky was overcast, heavy with gray clouds, promising rain. I loaded my old Jeep with camping gear, food, firewood, and Max hopped in eagerly, tail wagging. The drive was peaceful. The highway gave way to narrow, twisting roads that climbed higher and higher through dense forest. Around noon, I pulled up to the cabin, parked, and stepped out, breathing in the cold, pine-scented air. The cabin was older than I expected. The wood was cracked in places, the roof sagging slightly, but it felt sturdy. Inside, dust covered most surfaces, and the smell of damp wood and old smoke filled the air. I opened the windows, letting in the fresh mountain air. Max circled the cabin, sniffing everything, alert but calm. I spent the afternoon chopping wood, stacking it carefully by the porch. Max stayed close, his ears twitching at every distant sound. Birds, rustling leaves, maybe a squirrel. The only sign of human life was the occasional car on the faraway highway, and even those were rare. That night, I built a fire in the stone fireplace, watching the flames flicker and dance. Max lay by my feet, occasionally glancing toward the window as if expecting someone. The silence outside was heavy, except for the occasional howl of a distant coyote. The next few days passed quietly. I woke with the sun, made coffee on a small camping stove, and took long walks with Max through the woods. The forest was alive with the soft sounds of nature, branches snapping underfoot, birds calling, leaves falling. I read old books, repaired the cabin's creaky door latch, and cooked simple meals over the fire. Max was content, as was I, but on the fourth night, something changed. I was sitting by the fire, the orange glow warming my face, when I heard a sharp noise outside. It was faint, like a branch breaking, but it made Max stiffen immediately. His ears perked up, and he growled low in his throat. I told myself it was just an animal, a deer, maybe a raccoon. The forest was full of them. Still, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, Max at my side. The night was darker than usual, the clouds thicker, blocking the moon and stars. The trees swayed with the wind, casting long, moving shadows. I walked around the cabin, shining the flashlight into the dark forest. The beam caught on something near the edge of the clearing. A shape, maybe a person? My heart jumped. I called out softly, but no answer. Max growled again, closer now, low and threatening. I decided to head back inside and lock the door. Once inside, I checked the windows, making sure they were secure. Max sat by the door, alert and tense. I stayed up late that night, fire burning low, every creak and rustle making me jump. The next day, I found signs someone had been close to the cabin. Near the creek, I saw footprints, large, booted prints leading into the forest, but none returning. They were fresh, no older than a day. I tried to tell myself it was a hunter or a hiker. The area wasn't off limits, after all. But I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. That afternoon, while chopping more wood, I noticed scratches on the cabin's wooden walls. Deep, jagged marks as if someone or something had clawed at them. I examined them closely, and the bark of a nearby tree bore similar scratches. The patterns looked too deliberate to be random animal marks. At dusk, I sat by the fire again, Max closer than ever. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees. Suddenly, a loud thump hit the side of the cabin. I froze. Another thump, louder this time, like a heavy fist pounding on the wood. Max barked sharply and ran to the door, growling fiercely. I grabbed my hunting knife from the table, heart pounding. Outside, the pounding stopped. Then, a silence so deep I could hear my own breathing. I stayed awake most of the night, listening. At dawn, the sun broke through the clouds, and the forest came alive again with light and sound. I stepped outside cautiously, inspecting the cabin walls. More scratches, and something else. Several small pieces of torn fabric snagged on the wood near the door. I felt watched. The idea wasn't pleasant, but I knew I wasn't alone. Over the next 2 days, I didn't see anyone.
No footprints, no sounds.
Max stayed alert but relaxed somewhat. I tried to enjoy the calm, but my mind kept racing, wondering who had been out there. On the 6th day, I went for a longer walk, trying to push away the fear. I walked deeper into the forest, following an old logging trail. The trees were taller here, older, casting heavy shadows. I noticed a few small campsites, fire rings cold and abandoned. It made me think someone else used this area regularly. Then, I found something that chilled me to the bone. A shallow pit dug into the dirt, about 5 feet wide and 3 feet deep. Inside, scattered scraps of wood, some torn clothes and bones. Animal bones, but broken and gnawed at in a way I'd never seen. Near the pit, I saw footprints again, much bigger this time. I hurried back to the cabin, my stomach twisting with dread. I felt trapped and vulnerable, so far from help. That night, the pounding returned. But this time, it wasn't on the cabin. It was on the front door. Max snarled and barked fiercely. I held the knife tighter. I stood there in the dark, waiting, my eyes fixed on the door. The pounding continued for minutes, relentless, then stopped. I waited longer before opening the door slightly, flashlight in hand. Outside was empty. No footprints in the mud, no sound but the wind. I locked the door and sat down, trying to steady my breathing. The next morning, I packed up. I couldn't stay another night in that cabin, not knowing if someone was out there watching, waiting. Driving away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following. But the forest swallowed everything back up into silence. Back in Seattle, I called the friend whose uncle owned the cabin and told him what happened. He was surprised but not shocked. He said a few locals sometimes came by, sometimes people looking for privacy or hiding something. I never went back, but Max and I still take long walks in the park, and sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I remember those dark nights, the pounding on the door, and the feeling that someone, somewhere, had been watching. I was 34 when I took the job in Montana. It was the summer of 2006. I had been bouncing around between outdoor jobs for years, trail maintenance in Oregon, wildfire watch in Arizona, guiding hikers in Utah. Nothing stuck. I liked being alone, I liked the woods, and I liked silence. Maybe that's what led me to that ranger posting near Fort Logan, a remote patch of protected forest about an hour south of Helena. The place was quiet, too quiet for most people, but I liked it that way. There was a ranger's cabin up in the mountains, an old one, sitting near the edge of a long-forgotten fire road that was barely drivable. Most rangers didn't bother with it anymore. There were newer outposts lower down with solar power and satellite internet. But I didn't care about that. The old one was built in the 1940s, big logs stacked with stone and cement, a wood stove inside, a hand pump for water out back. It wasn't cozy, but it worked. I requested that post, and they gave it to me. I think they were just happy someone actually wanted to be that far out. I had to check in once every 3 days on the radio and do the rounds, trail inspections, boundary checks, wildlife logs. It was a big range, maybe 20 square miles under my watch, and I'd ride my quad to cover as much as I could. Sometimes I walked when the terrain got rough. It was July when I moved in. The weather was hot during the day, chilly at night. The cabin smelled like dust and creosote. There were scratches on the wooden floors, old ones like someone dragged furniture around or something heavier. The mattress was just a pad of foam that mice had already chewed holes through. I brought my own cot. I scrubbed everything with bleach, filled 2 trash bags with old junk left behind. Boots, rusted cans, a broken lantern. The first 2 weeks were quiet. I spent most days outside. Bears were still low in the valleys that time of year, and I saw their tracks but never ran into one. Deer and elk were common. I'd log them down, check for poachers' traps, and then head back by dusk. I never saw another soul up there.
No hikers, no campers.
Not even another ranger. Then I started noticing something strange on the second Sunday. I had just returned from a long sweep of the East Ridge, climbed about 5 miles out to a crumbling lookout post and checked the radio tower up there. By the time I got back, the sun was already dropping behind the western range. I parked the quad beside the cabin, and something caught my eye right away. The back door was open. That was odd. I always locked it. There were no animals that could open it, not even bears, and I hadn't seen signs of anyone else out here. No boot prints, no tire tracks but my own. I walked around, took a good look. The door wasn't broken, just hanging open an inch or two. I nudged it with my boot. Inside, everything looked the same except for my cot. It had been moved about 2 feet from the wall. I stood there for a while, just staring. Nothing else was touched. My bag was zipped, my food was sealed, my tools were in place. but the cot had been moved, and there were faint marks in the dust, boot prints. Not mine, bigger. I didn't have a gun. Rangers in that area didn't carry unless they were closer to Yellowstone or grizzly zones. I had bear spray and a hatchet. That night, I kept both beside my bed. I pushed the cot back against the wall and didn't sleep much. Every time I heard a creak or branch shift outside, my eyes snapped open. By morning, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe I had moved the cot without thinking. Maybe I'd left the back door loose. That was how I wrote it in my report. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but something had changed. Over the next few days, I started noticing more things. A tin mug missing from the hook above the sink. A notebook I left on the table turned a different way. A scrape on the wooden floor that hadn't been there before. Small things, easy to miss, easy to ignore, but I didn't ignore them. On the fourth day, I set a trap. I placed a twig in the back door hinge and a thin line of fishing wire across the floor just inside. Too light to be seen unless you were looking for it. If someone walked through, they'd snap it. I left a sheet of paper by the window, too. Just set it down loosely to see if it moved. Then I left. I took the quad and rode 5 miles down the mountain to check the fence lines near the old logging road. I took my time. Didn't come back until nearly 9 at night. When I got back, the sun was gone and the trees were throwing long shadows. The wire inside the cabin was snapped. The twig in the hinge was on the floor, and the paper was crumpled, like someone had picked it up and put it back down carelessly. But the cabin looked untouched otherwise. My food was sealed, my tools unmoved. No sign of forced entry. No sign of anyone walking up the dirt road. That night, I stayed awake. I turned off the lantern at 10 and sat on my cot in the dark, staring at the door. The moonlight through the window was just bright enough to see the outline of the room. At some point after midnight, I heard it. A footstep, just one, came from outside, gravel crunching under weight. Then silence. I stayed still, hardly breathing. Then another footstep. Closer. I didn't move. I kept the hatchet tight in my hand. Another step. Then a shadow passed by the window, tall, wide. A man. Not a bear, not a moose. Person. I didn't speak. I didn't make a sound. The footsteps moved around to the back of the cabin, and I heard the faint sound of the door handle turn. It didn't open. I had locked it this time. Deadbolt. Silence again. I waited. After a long while, the footsteps moved away, down the hill, slow and steady. I waited another hour before I moved. I didn't sleep. In the morning, I found boot prints in the dirt, deep ones from heavy boots. They circled the cabin and headed down the slope toward the trees. I followed them as far as I could, but they vanished into the brush. I reported it that day, radioed into base, and told them someone had tried to get into the cabin. They said they'd send someone up the next morning, but I knew that meant late afternoon at best. I was alone up there for another night. That evening, I blocked the back door with a dresser. I pulled my cot to the middle of the room. I kept the hatchet beside me again and a flashlight in my hand. The man didn't come back that night, but something else did. At around 2 in the morning, I heard a scratching sound. Not at the door, underneath the cabin, like nails on wood. The cabin was raised slightly on stacked stone footings, with maybe a foot or so of crawl space beneath. Something was under there. I crouched on the floor and held my breath. The scratching stopped. Then came a thud. Then silence. I waited. Nothing else. At first light, I went outside and circled the cabin. I found a small hatch at the back I hadn't noticed before, leading under the floor. It was sealed shut, padlocked, but the lock was rusted and broken, hanging open. I pulled the hatch open and shined my light under the cabin. There was a sleeping bag down there, a worn, dirty sleeping bag, crumpled against the beams. A plastic bag of food wrappers beside it, empty cans, a stained water bottle, Someone had been living under my cabin. I backed away slowly. My stomach felt cold and tight. I called it in right away, told base everything. They told me to stay put, and they'd send a wildlife officer and 2 deputies up the mountain. They got there by mid-afternoon. The officers searched the crawl space and took the evidence. They found old wrappers, tools, and even a torn map with markings on it. Circles around certain trails, lines through others. The sleeping bag was filthy, probably hadn't been cleaned in years. They didn't find the man. The deputies set up a motion camera on the trail and another near the back door. They left it there for a week. In that time, I was told to stay in town at the ranger station. I didn't argue. A week later, they pulled the footage. 3 nights after I left, someone came back. The camera showed a man, late 50s maybe, wearing army surplus gear, beard down to his chest, long hair tucked under a cap. He walked straight up to the cabin, tried the door, then crawled under it. Stayed there all night. Didn't come out until morning. They ran his face through local law enforcement records and found nothing. No ID, no name. They never caught him. I didn't go back to that cabin. I requested transfer to a lower station, and they gave it to me without asking questions. The old cabin was sealed off, the hatch welded shut, the logs bolted. No one stays up there anymore. I still think about that man, how long he'd been under there, how many nights I'd slept above him without knowing. I still wonder what his plan was. If I hadn't moved the cot, if I hadn't heard that step. I don't take remote jobs anymore. I still love the woods, but I sleep where other people are. I double-check the locks. I don't ignore small details. Sometimes it's not the wilderness you need to worry about. It's who's hiding in it. I didn't plan to go camping that week. It was early October 1998, and the air had just started turning cold in northern Vermont. The leaves were halfway through their change, a mess of burnt oranges and deep reds, and the sun was setting earlier each day. I was 32 years old then, working a desk job in Burlington that left me drained and restless. I needed time away from noise, people, and the endless hum of the city. The cabin wasn't mine, not exactly. It belonged to my uncle, Tom, who lived further north, close to the Canadian border. He was a quiet man, a hunter mostly, and he had handed me the keys a few years back, saying I could use it anytime I wanted peace. I'd never stayed there alone before. The thought of spending a few nights by myself in that old wooden cabin felt like a small adventure, something to clear my head. I left the city just before dawn, packed lightly, and drove north. The road twisted and narrowed as I passed through small towns that looked like they hadn't changed in decades. Old gas stations, a rusty diner here and there, a few farms where I saw only the distant shapes of cattle or horses. The last few miles were on a gravel road that shook the car as I drove. The cabin sat on a ridge overlooking a wide valley, the kind you'd see in old postcards. Thick woods surrounded it, pine, maple, birch, and the lake was just down a steep hill behind the trees. When I pulled up, the cabin looked just as I remembered. Rough timber walls stained dark by years of rain, a stone chimney rising from the roof, and a wooden porch with a broken rocking chair. The windows were dusty but intact. A faint smell of wood smoke lingered in the air. I unloaded my bag slowly, taking in the silence. No cars, no planes, no distant voices. Just wind stirring the trees and the occasional bird call. It was peaceful. I liked it. Inside, the cabin was simple but cozy. A small kitchen with a wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, a sofa covered in faded fabric, and a single bedroom with a creaky bed. I ran my fingers over the wooden floorboards, worn smooth by years of boots and footsteps. The place smelled like pine needles and old smoke. That first night, I lit the stove and sat by the fire with a book. Outside, the wind picked up and rattled the windows, but inside, I felt safe. I had brought canned food, water, and a small flashlight. No phone reception, but that was the point. I fell asleep early. The second day, I woke before sunrise and stepped outside. The cold air hit my face, sharp and clean. Mist hovered over the lake, making the water look like glass. I made coffee on the stove and watched as the sun slowly rose, casting golden light over the trees. I spent the morning hiking around the property, following faint paths my uncle had once marked. The forest was thick and quiet, the ground soft with moss and fallen leaves. I found an old hunting stand high up in a tree, rusted but still sturdy. I climbed it, and from there, I could see for miles, the valley stretching out like a patchwork quilt. Around midday, I returned to the cabin and tried to read again, but the silence started to feel heavy. I wasn't used to being alone like this, and the woods felt different, thicker, watching. I told myself it was just my imagination. That night, something changed. I was lying in bed, the wind howling outside, when I heard a faint noise, a scraping sound near the back door. I froze, listening. It was quick, almost like a branch brushing against the wood. I grabbed the flashlight and crept downstairs. The porch was empty. The forest edge beyond the clearing was dark and still. I checked the windows. Nothing. I shook my head and went back inside, locking the doors. Sleep didn't come easily after that. The third day, I decided to explore further. I packed a small bag with water and food and followed a stream I hadn't noticed before. It twisted through the trees, leading to a clearing with a stone foundation. An old cabin, long abandoned. The walls had fallen, and moss covered the stones, but I could tell someone had lived here once. I felt a strange chill standing there, like the place remembered something. I took a few pictures with my camera and hurried back, feeling eyes on me from the woods. Back at the cabin, I locked the doors again. The wind was quieter now, but the night felt colder, darker. I lit the stove and sat with a baseball bat beside me, just in case. That night, the noises came again, louder this time. Footsteps crunching leaves, a low thump against the walls. I could hear breathing outside, shallow and ragged. I stayed awake until dawn, my eyes scanning the windows, my heart pounding. The fourth day was tense. I didn't leave the cabin. I kept the doors locked and the bat close. The silence was broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or rustle of leaves. I caught glimpses of shadows moving at the edge of the trees. I knew someone was out there. I debated what to do. I didn't want to call for help and look foolish if it was just animals or my imagination. But I was scared. That night, I prepared myself. I set a few makeshift traps outside. Rocks balanced on sticks, a tripwire made from fishing line, anything to alert me if someone tried to approach. I stayed up all night listening. At around 3 a.m., the tripwire snapped, the rocks clattering to the ground. My heart jumped. I grabbed the bat and edged to the door, shining my flashlight out. I saw a figure crouching in the shadows, just beyond the porch light. The beam caught a glimpse of a worn jacket and a face partly hidden by a hood. The figure froze, then disappeared into the woods. I called the police from a payphone in the nearest town the next morning. They said they would send someone out, but it would take a while. I stayed inside the cabin the rest of the day, watching the forest edge. No one came close again. The fifth day, the police arrived. 2 officers drove up in a truck and searched the area. They found footprints around the cabin, large, dirty boots, not like any animals. They said it looked like someone had been watching me, maybe even living nearby. I packed my things that afternoon. The experience had shaken me more than I expected. The peace I wanted was gone, replaced by a deep unease. As I drove away, I looked back once at the cabin, standing silent among the trees. The forest seemed calm again, but I knew it was only waiting. The woods hold their secrets, I realized. And sometimes those secrets are people you don't want to meet. It was the summer of 2014 when I first drove up to the cabin on Devil's Ridge, a remote part of northern Vermont. I was 34 years old, working as a carpenter in Burlington, but for the last few years, I'd been feeling restless. The city had started to feel smaller and smaller, the noise and rush draining something out of me. My cousin, Mark, had left me the cabin after his sudden death in a logging accident the year before. It was a rough, weather-beaten wooden structure, sitting on a small clearing near the edge of a dense pine forest. I didn't know much about the place when I first arrived, just that Mark had built it with his own hands back in the early 90s and used it mostly for hunting and getting away from the world. I wasn't sure what I wanted from it myself, but the silence out here, the thick trees, the air that smelled sharp and clean, was exactly what I needed. The road to the cabin was a narrow, dirt track that twisted through thick woods. It was rough on my old pickup, but I had no choice but to take it slow. The last few miles were covered in pine needles and fallen branches. The sun was low when I finally pulled into the small clearing. The cabin sat crookedly on a gentle slope, surrounded by tall, dark trees. It looked older than I thought, the wood faded and cracked from years of weather. I grabbed my bags and walked up the creaky wooden steps to the front door. The place smelled like old pine and dust. The windows were grimy, and the screen door hung loosely on one hinge. Inside, the cabin was small, maybe 20 by 20 feet, with a single room that had a wood stove in the corner, a small kitchen area, and a loft above for sleeping. I set my bags down and opened a window to let the fresh air in. I spent the first few days cleaning and fixing things, repairing the door, clearing out the fireplace, and stacking wood from the pile Mark had left beside the cabin. It was peaceful, and I started to settle in. I took long walks during the day, exploring the surrounding forest, and in the evenings I sat by the stove reading or just listening to the sounds outside. But even in this calm, I couldn't shake a growing unease. At night, the forest seemed to press close to the cabin, the darkness thick and absolute. The wind whispered through the trees, but sometimes I thought I heard something else. The snap of a twig, the soft rustle of footsteps, just beyond the edge of the clearing. The first night, I shrugged it off. I was in the woods. Animals moved around at night. It was natural. But as the days passed, the sounds grew closer, and the feeling of being watched became harder to ignore. One afternoon, I decided to hike further up the ridge. I wanted to see the view Mark used to talk about, a lookout point where you could see the valley and the winding river below. The forest thickened as I climbed, the ground uneven and rocky. I noticed fresh deer tracks in the mud and caught sight of a red fox darting between the trees. When I reached the lookout, the view was stunning. The valley stretched out before me, a patchwork of green fields and winding roads. The river sparkled in the afternoon sun. I sat on a large rock and pulled out my water bottle, feeling calm. Then I noticed something else, a set of footprints not far from the rock. They were deep, larger than a man's, and they headed toward the cabin. I frowned. Mark hadn't mentioned any hunters or visitors. The area was supposed to be quiet, but someone had been here recently. The footprints looked fresh. A little chill ran down my back, but I told myself it was just another hiker or a hunter passing through. That evening, as the sun dipped below the trees, I started a fire outside the cabin. The smoke curled up into the sky, and I sat staring into the flames, the quiet broken only by the occasional crack of burning wood. Suddenly, I heard a noise behind me, the crunch of leaves and twigs. I spun around, but the darkness swallowed everything. Nothing. The firelight didn't reach far enough to show anything beyond the clearing. I went inside and locked the door, checking the windows. I felt foolish, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I tried to keep myself busy. More repairs, chopping wood, organizing supplies. The isolation was beginning to weigh on me. A few nights later, I woke to the sound of something hitting the side of the cabin. It was faint but definite, something solid like a rock or a branch. I lay still, listening, but there was nothing else. In the morning, I found scratches on the wooden siding near the back door. Deep, jagged gouges, like claws. I checked my gun. An old hunting rifle Mark had left behind, and made sure it was loaded. I never thought I'd need it, but out here you never knew. The next day, I found more signs. Footprints in the soft ground near the cabin. Not human. They were large, with 5 toes, but not quite animal either. They were weird, as if something was walking on 2 feet but not a person. I couldn't make sense of it. I told myself it had to be a bear or maybe a large dog, but something about the prints was wrong. They walked upright, too. I took photos with my phone, but the light was poor. The woods around the cabin started to feel hostile. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, as if the trees were watching me back. The wind no longer felt like a breeze, but like a warning. One afternoon, I went out to check the trapline Mark had set up near a small stream. The traps were old but still functional. When I reached the area, I found one trap snapped shut, empty, but there was no sign of the animal it caught. Instead, the ground around the trap was disturbed, the dirt torn up as if something had dug it out. I looked up and saw deep scratches on the trees nearby, higher than any animal could reach, claw marks gouged into the bark. I felt like I was being watched again and hurried back to the cabin. That night, the noises outside were relentless. Branches breaking, twigs snapping, something heavy moving through the underbrush. I stayed close to the fire, rifle in hand. At one point, a loud thud against the cabin's side made me jump. I shone my flashlight out the window but saw nothing. I tried to call for help, but there was no cell signal. I was truly alone. The next day, I decided to leave. I packed my bags, loaded the rifle, and drove back down the ridge. I didn't look back. The city didn't seem so bad after all. But as I drove down the dirt road, I caught sight of something standing at the edge of the forest. A tall figure, barely visible among the trees. It didn't move. It watched me until I disappeared from sight. Weeks later, I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin. The feeling of being watched, the strange footprints, the scratches, the noises. None of it made sense. Mark's accident had been ruled a logging mishap, but now I wondered if the isolation had hidden something darker. I spoke to a local game warden who had worked the area for years. He told me stories about people going missing around Devil's Ridge, hunters who never came back, strange noises in the night. He said the forest was home to many animals, but sometimes something else lived there. Something that didn't show itself but left its mark. I never went back to the cabin, but sometimes, when the wind howls and the trees bend under the storm, I remember that place. The silence, the dark, and the feeling of eyes just beyond the firelight. I never expected a trip to the Amazon jungle to become something I would remember for the rest of my life, and not for the reasons I imagined when I first planned it. I thought it would be a peaceful escape, a break from my routine in Sao Paulo, Brazil. I wanted to get away from the city noise, the endless emails, and the crowded streets. Instead, I found myself trapped in a small wooden cabin deep inside the jungle, caught in a situation I barely understood until it was almost too late. The year was 2013. I was 28, working as a freelance photographer. I loved taking pictures of nature, animals, and the people who live close to the earth. When I heard about a chance to visit a remote village near the Rio Negro, I didn't hesitate. The promise of untouched forests, exotic birds, and rivers flowing through thick green made me eager to go. I wasn't alone. I was with a guide named Louise, a local from a small village near the river, who knew the jungle better than anyone I'd ever met. Louise was quiet but skilled. He knew which plants were safe, how to avoid snakes, and how to track animals. He assured me the cabin we would stay in was simple but safe. It was built by a family who had left years ago, and it stood on stilts near the riverbank, made of dark wood with a roof of palm leaves. It looked small but sturdy from the outside. The first day was perfect. We arrived by boat early in the morning. The air was thick and humid, filled with the sounds of birds and insects. The smell of wet earth and plants was strong. Louise showed me how to start a fire using dry wood and some leaves. The cabin had no electricity or running water, but Louise carried a water filter, and I brought a small solar charger for my camera battery. I was ready for this kind of adventure. At night, the jungle came alive with noise. Frogs croaked, cicadas buzzed, and distant howls echoed through the trees. I slept on a thin mattress on the floor, listening to the sounds outside, feeling completely isolated from the rest of the world. But I liked that. I felt free. The next few days were spent hiking and photographing. Louise took me to some hidden spots: a waterfall, a place where giant otters played, and a small clearing where parrots nested. Each evening, we returned to the cabin and cooked fish Louise caught with a handmade spear. Life was simple, slow, and peaceful. But on the fifth night, something changed. It started as a small noise outside the cabin. I was lying on my mattress, half asleep, when I heard a faint rustling near the window. Louise was already asleep on the hammock nearby. I thought maybe it was an animal, a monkey or some bird. The jungle was full of creatures. But then the rustling grew louder, like someone moving through the leaves. I held my breath, heart beating faster. I didn't want to wake Louise because I wasn't sure if I was imagining things. The noise stopped for a few minutes, then started again, closer this time. I tried to look out the window, but it was pitch black outside. The only light was the moon, hidden behind clouds. The cabin's walls were thin, made of wooden planks, and the windows had no glass, only wooden shutters. I could see the shadow of a large tree just outside. Suddenly, I heard a low growl. It was deep and guttural, not an animal I knew. I wanted to call Louise, but my voice caught in my throat. The growling moved slowly around the cabin, circling it, then stopped near the door. My skin crawled. I remembered Louise had told me to always keep the door closed and locked at night. I looked at the door. It was shut, but the lock was a simple wooden latch. I got up quietly and moved closer. Then, a sharp knock hit the door, hard, deliberate, and slow. I froze. The knock came again 3 times. I didn't know what to do. I thought maybe it was a lost villager or a hunter. But at this hour, no one should be outside in this part of the jungle. My hands trembled as I reached for the small knife I always kept in my bag. Louise stirred in the hammock but didn't wake up. I whispered to myself that it was probably an animal, maybe a jaguar or something else curious. But the knock was so deliberate, so human. I decided not to open the door. Instead, I moved to the back window and looked out. Nothing, just trees and darkness. The jungle was quiet again, except for the usual night sounds. I returned to the mattress, trying to calm down. My heart was pounding like a drum. I stayed awake for hours, listening for any more sounds. But nothing came. The next morning, Louise noticed I hadn't slept well. I told him about the knocking, the growling, and the noises. He frowned deeply and said something in Portuguese I didn't understand at first. Then he told me to be careful and not to leave the cabin alone after dark. He said some people in the nearby villages believed there were thieves who moved through the jungle, stealing from hunters and travelers. Sometimes they were violent. Louise didn't say much more, but I sensed he was worried. I tried to brush it off. I thought the jungle was a wild but safe place if you respected it. But after that night, I was on edge. Every sound made me jump. I didn't sleep well again. On the 7th day, something happened that changed everything. That afternoon, Louise went to check the traps he had set earlier in the week. He told me to stay in the cabin and not go anywhere alone. I agreed, though the cabin felt like a prison now. I spent the afternoon cleaning my camera lenses and writing notes about the trip. The sun was hot outside, and I could hear the river flowing nearby. Around 5 p.m., Louise had not returned yet. I started to worry. The sun was sinking fast. I decided to wait a little longer. Then I heard a noise from the riverbank, the sound of footsteps running on dry leaves. I looked out the window and saw Louise, but he wasn't alone. Behind him, a tall man was moving quickly toward the cabin. I didn't recognize the man. His clothes were dirty and torn, and he had a wild look in his eyes. He was carrying something long and sharp in his hand, a machete. My heart jumped into my throat. I realized the man wasn't friendly. I slammed the window shut and locked the wooden latch as fast as I could. Louise saw the man and shouted something, waving his arms. The stranger didn't stop. He pushed Louise aside and moved toward the door of the cabin. I grabbed my knife and moved to the door. The man hit the door hard with the machete, splintering the wood. The lock broke. I was trapped. Louise tried to pull the man back, but the stranger was stronger and more violent. They struggled near the door, and I heard the sound of Louise falling hard to the ground. Panic filled me. I looked for a way out. The back window was too small to escape through, and the front door was broken. I grabbed my camera bag and threw it at the man's head. He staggered but didn't stop. I ran to the kitchen area and grabbed a heavy metal pot. I threw it with all my strength. The pot hit the man's face. He stumbled back, bleeding from a cut near his eye. Louise got up and punched the man in the stomach. The stranger grunted and fell to the ground, unconscious. We didn't wait to see if he would wake up. Louise and I quickly gathered what we needed. I packed my camera and a few supplies, while Louise grabbed the machete. We left the cabin through a small gap in the broken door and ran toward the river. The jungle around us was thick and dark. The sounds of animals and insects were louder than ever. We reached the river and saw the boat Louise had used to bring me here. It was tied to a tree, rocking gently on the water. We jumped in and started the motor. As we moved away from the cabin, the stranger started to come to. Louise shouted and hit him with the paddle. The man fell back into the jungle. We didn't stop. The boat moved fast on the river, cutting through the water. After what felt like hours, we reached a larger village where Louise knew people. The police came quickly. They found the man near the river, drunk and confused. He was arrested for attempted robbery and assault. Later, Louise told me the man was known in the area as a dangerous criminal who sometimes attacked travelers. The jungle was not always a safe place, especially near small villages where poverty and crime existed. I never went back to that cabin. The trip was supposed to be an escape, but it became a fight for survival. I still have the photos I took in the first days. Pictures of birds, rivers, and trees untouched by humans. But I don't look at them often. They remind me of the fear and danger I faced in the heart of the Amazon. I learned a hard lesson about respect and caution in the wild. The jungle is beautiful but unforgiving. Not every danger comes from animals or nature. Sometimes the greatest threat comes from people. Now, I stick to safer trips. But every once in a while, I think about that cabin by the river, the night of the knocks, and the man with the machete. And I feel a cold shiver down my spine, because the jungle doesn't forget. And sometimes neither do I.